Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity was first announced on the 8th of September 2020 and released on November 20th, 2020. This game is a story set 100 years before Breath of the Wild, allowing us to witness the events of the Calamity. Previously, there had been a Hyrule Warriors game that involved characters from all over the series, and while being far from perfect, was an enjoyable game and provided a vast amount of fan service. It was clear that the Warriors' style of gameplay could allow Breath of the Wild's prequel story to be told through its own game, as Hyrule Warriors combat is more suited to a war situation, and is something many fans would already be familiar with. It was upon the release of the demo, allowing all of Chapter 1 to be played, that many fans were confused. The opening to the game showed that time travel was involved, and the story began to change the timeline as we knew it. Some fans were shocked, trying to understand if it was an alternate timeline or a time loop. While it may still end with the Calamity destroying Hyrule, so much of the canon would be changed that it couldn't lead into Breath of the Wild anyway. After playing this demo, I saw a lot of potential in this game. I was somewhat disappointed to find that this game wouldn't be the canon prequel story, but what we seemed to be getting was fine. The gameplay was what intrigued me more. There seemed to be some upgrades to the combat from the original Hyrule Warriors that could mean that this game would have a better combat flow overall. After playing the entire game, I came to some strong conclusions, and despite not originally ever planning on writing a critique of this game, by the end of it, I really wanted to. When first coming across the combat of Age of Calamity, I was somewhat impressed. Lots of new elements were being brought in, such as flurry rushing, the ability for some characters to parry, and using the runes as either a counter system or an additional method for combat. One-on-one fights in the original Hyrule Warriors became limited. You could use any combos you wanted to take down enemies and would often learn the most efficient ones to use, but this made some of the larger units feel slightly repetitive. Concluding that Hyrule Warriors one-on-one combat was not the game's strong suit is not exactly controversial. After playing the first chapter of Age of Calamity, it would seem that these additions vastly improved the one-on-one combat found within the game. In the original Hyrule Warriors, many of the characters had variation in their styles and speeds, but not all of them had their own gimmick. The combat felt relatively similar outside of the different combos you would prioritize. I would argue that despite not all having gimmicks, the characters felt different enough sometimes that I would use certain characters over others for different tasks. Age of Calamity gives each character their own special ability or gimmick. Link has a bow and an arrow that he can use to hit weak points and shoot barrels, as well as shield surfing. Impa can create clone, Zelda has powered up versions of the rune, Rivali has different combat modes, and so on and so forth. This is an improvement on the character variation in the original Hyrule Warriors for the most part. Not that Hyrule Warriors didn't have characters with gimmicks, but this game almost makes it certain that each character has a different playstyle that should feel different. Despite every character having more unique movesets in this game than other entries, characters will all feel the same for one fundamental reason, which I will get to. Killing smaller enemy units has never been more pointless in a Warriors game, and I will come back to this point as well later, but right now let's focus on why this affects the game's combat. In the original Hyrule Warriors, killing small units was absolutely necessary. Smaller units had the ability to take over your base or keeps by overwhelming them. If you let too many small units build up, it could lead to your defeat. Keeps would also have large waves of enemies that would need to be defeated. Because of this, it was crucial that you knew the most efficient ways of taking down large groups of small enemies. When working through Age of Calamity's main campaign, you may need to kill some smaller units now and then to take over an outpost if a mission requires it of you. But essentially the entirety of the combat just comes down to fighting big enemies. After perhaps 3 or 4 main campaign missions, you will learn that defeating big enemies requires nothing more than 2 things: flurry rushes and using the runes as counters. That's all you need to do. It is the most efficient way to do damage and almost the only way to get damage in on higher difficulties. In this sense, every single character's best strategy ends up being overwhelmingly similar. And this is even more of a problem when it makes every enemy type feel similar in how to defeat them. Maybe they have different moves, but every enemy has slow wind-up attacks that you need to be ready to dodge. And if you dodge at the perfect time, dish out your most efficient combo, take down the meter, the enemy's defeated. Moves looking different and having slightly different speeds does not make the strategy any different. They are things that are important to distinguish. This brings me on to the parry system this game has for characters that have a shield. Parrying in video games has become a staple of melee combat, especially in your more difficult video games. It is the idea of anticipating or reacting to an enemy's move in perfect time to reward the player, while also potentially punishing them. Though this often takes much time and practice, a game should reward the player with an opening or additional damage to the enemy. In games such as Dark Souls, the timing is hard, but you get a critical hit upon a successful parry, rewarding players for their poise and practice significantly. In a different game such as Sekiro, the parry window is a fair bit wider, but it is vital to defeating enemies, and in some cases is more useful than ever attacking. These combat systems both tackle parrying in different ways, but are exceptional in the reward for skill aspect, increasing the difficulty of the combat system and rewarding players for their improving skill. Breath of the Wild also has a parry system. I don't want to break it down too heavily in this video, but the system is interesting. When facing an enemy much more powerful than you, the parry system is flashy, but completely ineffective. A flurry rush has a wider window than a parry, and is also safer as you're dodging away from an attack. A mistimed dodge is just a dodge, but a mistimed parry will cause you to get hit. The amount of damage in a successful parry is often at least a third of the damage to a successful dodge. The only time you should consider parrying is if your shield stats allow you to disarm the enemy in Breath of the Wild, despite this being something the majority of the players do not know is a factor. Age of Calamity has the same parry system for some reason, probably because, yet again, it's in Breath of the Wild. You can't disarm an enemy like in Breath of the Wild, and you don't do additional damage from it. Dodging gives you the opportunity for a flurry rush, and if you miss the window, again, you at least get the dodge. What's worse is that a successful flurry rush rewards you more than a successful parry, despite the parry being the riskier option. This is the opposite what should be the case. You can still get 1 or 2 hits against the enemy without a flurry rush, so in no situation is parrying useful. There are many options as any character with a shield that is safer. You don't even need to flurry rush. In fact, if you just walk away from an enemy and then stasis them once they do an attack, you will deplete their meter even faster. This is the safest and quickest way to defeat enemies, and once you realise that, the entire game becomes even more tedious. As is often a problem in this game, as we will see, it fails to do something more because it wasn't in Breath of the Wild. A parry should reward you, and a critical hit against a successful parry is a completely missed opportunity. The parry is here, and it's pointless, diminishing the complexity of the combat. Here is something I did not expect to have to criticise this game for. The complete removal of any strategy in the main missions of the game. Despite the game having enemy outposts, non-playable characters on the map and allied bases, these are all absolutely meaningless in the main missions with the exception of maybe one level, where at a certain point, enemies will attack the base and you can lose if the base is destroyed, but even then it's just one time. Aside from this one main mission, at no point does the game contain any strategy or diverge from the gameplay trope of kill the main enemies it tells you to. I played this game first time through in its hardest difficulty, and I never got a game over once on anything other than my character losing health. And in a combat strategy game, that is a big problem. Even losing from your character's losing health is a different problem. At any time where you're at low health, you can just switch to another character with full health, because main ally characters cannot die. You can drain them to a quarter heart, then just leave them and come back to them once you've collected some apples, the game's healing item. What annoys me most is that some of the strategy mechanics and other mission types which made Hyrule Warriors gameplay slightly more complex can be found in Age of Calamity. The side missions have many of the missions which kept gameplay fresh for a while, such as keeping allies safe, protecting a base. For some reason, they're so scarce in Age of Calamity. I believe less than 10% of the main missions will have any of this type of complexity added into it. You don't need to capture outposts to build up your army. You never have to worry about other enemies taking over your outposts, or groups of enemies invading your outposts, attacking an ally, or anything of the sort. There's no reason to worry about anything. There is no reason to make choices of whether to follow the main mission and defeat an enemy, or focus on saving other allies or keeps first. It's just not there. You can feel that this game is missing it. This turns the game into even more of a mindless hack and slash than people think this series is. This aspect alone significantly hurts the game, especially when compared to the original Hyrule Warriors. Though the one-on-one combat seemed better in this game, the addition of the Flurry Rush and the Stasis Rune made the combat feel the same throughout. Hyrule Warriors had you using different items against different bosses, different enemies could be attacked in different ways, and because the Flurry Rush didn't give you attack openings, you had to find them yourself. You had to know what attacks left the enemy vulnerable. The balance here is off. Though one-on-one combat initially seemed to be more complex than the original Hyrule Warriors, the addition of these mechanics just make all the fights feel the same. And yes, this even goes for boss fights. The combination of only ever needing to do one-on-one combat and the one-on-one combat becoming samey, well, you can guess that makes it a bit of a problem. What adds to this problem is another big issue in this game: the number of enemies and the variation in their combat. Now, for the sake of argument, we will consider two things. Firstly, that all the minion type enemies in this game just don't count, as they can mostly be ignored unless you are capturing a keep, and can simply be hacked away at by spamming. Secondly, the Malice and Elemental variation in enemies do not change the strategy or gameplay at all, as the only difference is the appearance, what damage type they do, and what rods can be used against them to take them down even more easily. The combat loop remains exactly the same, and if anything, the elemental versions of the enemies are easier by having a big exploitable and obvious weakness. In terms of common one-on-one enemy types, there are Moblins, Wizrobes, Moblins, Guardians, Moblins, Stone Taluses, Moblins, Hinox, Moblins, Lynels, Moblins, and Molduga. In terms of boss fights, there are Astor, who is fought twice, Koga, who is fought twice, Suga, who is fought thrice, Blight Ganons, who are all fought 3 times, the Evil Egg, and Calamity Ganon as the final boss. We're going to use statistics to get to grips with the problem here. There are, in essence, 7 main enemy types you will fight across the game. 1 or 2 levels may have a special enemy like Gerudo Captains and Yiga Blade Masters, but they do not bring any movesets to the table that you will need to learn to counter. All are very similar, if not versions of the Moblin moveset. Furthermore, the Molduga are rarely fought within the game, and are essentially a boss fight. Therefore, this game has essentially 6 main enemy types you will be fighting across the 20 main levels: Moblins, Wizrobes, Guardians, Taluses, Hinox, and Lynels. Across 20 levels, these are the only enemies. Worst of all, the Hinox, Lynels, and Taluses are relatively uncommon enemies compared to the others, found often at the end of levels or at the late game levels. Even if they were just as common, this would still mean you encounter and learn a third of the main enemy types in the opening level of the game. Moblins are the biggest problem here, as I can safely assume they are at least half of the main enemy encounters in this game, and will be mastered by the end of the first level. Here's another fun fact: there are just as many boss fights as main enemy types. The worst part is that Moblins will remain the biggest challenge of the whole game, bar maybe a Lynel now and then. Hinox and Taluses are so slow and predictable, you'll just spam flurry rushes on them. Guardians are an actual joke, and Wizrobes are just squishy ammo supplies for your magic rods. This game is killing Moblins. This game is just killing Moblins. For 20 hours. 30 to 40 hours if you play on a higher difficulty. And if you want to complete all 376 side missions, there's a lot of killing Moblins. I really hope you enjoy killing Moblins. I just realised if you want to count all 4 Blights as different bosses, which they are considering they have different movesets, then there are more boss fights than enemies. Holy fuck. There are more playable characters than enemy types. There are 18 playable characters. That's 18 characters to kill Moblins with. I can't even give the bosses much credit. You don't need to learn any of the moves. You can just block and move around in a circle until they do some bullshit you can take advantage of, and then stasis, and then throw out some moves, maybe do a flurry rush now and then. The only difficulty you ever come across is not being able to heal and being stuck in a boss arena. Difficulty in video games is a tool. If a game is well designed, death will be a teaching moment, helping the player improve at the game, and as they get better, hopefully find the game even more fun, as they are more likely to play the game as it was designed to be played. The original Hyrule Warriors did not have the best sense of difficulty for a few reasons. There are many ways in which difficulty options are done well. Sometimes it can be by simply having a difficult game, but offering accessibility options that make it easier, such as compasses, or power-ups, or the possibility of having someone to help you online. The best increases in difficulty can be to increase the speed of enemies, or their aggression against the player. Maybe the enemies will have better aim during the higher difficulties, or perhaps they'll have more moves that they will take from, so that the player needs to be more aware of the different things they can do. There are a lot of good options of increasing the difficulty of a game. Age of Calamity does 3 things to increase its difficulty. Scales up the enemy health, scales up the enemy damage, scales down the availability of healing items. A problem with Breath of the Wild was that the increasing enemy difficulty was simply increasing enemies' health and damage. The strategy for defeating an enemy stayed the same from 1 minute into the game to 100 hours into the game, so difficulty never felt difficult. However, this was not a game-breaking problem, considering combat was not the most important part of Breath of the Wild. As I've stated before, Age of Calamity only has one-on-one combat as its main gameplay. This causes the higher difficulty options to have a big problem. At the start of the game I enjoyed the difficulty, especially coming out of Hyrule Warriors, which I thought was far too easy. I truly felt like I was being punished for just hacking and slashing instead of taking advantage of the game's combat options, such as the flurry rush and the rune counter. Well, I eventually learnt how to flurry rush, and dying no longer taught me anything. I've already discussed how combat affects this game, but the higher difficulty also started to disappoint. The game no longer became punishing but irritating in how it balanced out damage to the player and your health recovery. By the midpoint of the game, 1 or 2 hits from any significant enemy will drop your health down to a quarter heart, just to prevent you from dying instantly. For the remainder of the mission, you will remain in this state of being 1 hit from death. The health item in this game, being the apple, heals such an insignificant amount of your health in proportion to your damage. And these apples are scarce, they are incredibly hard to find. What you instead get is an irritating loop of reloading from checkpoints and spending the majority of the level in a low health state. What's crazy is that when a character is not being used by the player, as I said before, they can't die. Anytime I had a character on a quarter heart, I would have to just switch to another character until they got hit once and they went down to a quarter health. You will on most levels genuinely have more characters available to you than apples to heal with. You are also far more likely to heal during the game by leveling up than you are by finding apples. This does not make the game any more difficult, however. This often simply comes from being overwhelmed with enemies and not being able to see what's going on, and when you die you simply restart the most recent checkpoint of that level again. I never felt like I actually improved when I passed a section, but instead that I just got through it that time. The first 2 or 3 levels got me to improve, but eventually you're just dying now and then and not always knowing why, and stuck in irritating loops. So not only was this game fighting 100 moblins, and each moblin being a spamming of flurry rushes, stasis runes, and your single best combo to break their meter, this game was doing all of that while being allowed to be hit 6 or 7 times during the entire level. Once you've fought 10 moblins in a row, you feel like you've got nothing left to prove. Perhaps you become bored, let your guard down, and get hit once. This doesn't mean you're bad at the game or deserve to be punished and you need to try again, yet the game's difficulty will treat it as such. What becomes more irritating is being locked into a boss fight with a quarter heart, no apples, and no warning that you are now stuck here. The scaled health can make these boss fights take ridiculous amounts of time. Sometimes the boss fights will take even longer than the level itself. And in these extremely lengthy portions of time, you can only be hit once, or the whole fight starts again. Even if you aren't locked in a fight, there will be some stages that you can spend 20 minutes trying to find 1 apple, but simply cannot, and have no option but to move onto the boss and hope you never get hit. My most irritating experience with this was trying to fight Windblight Ganon. I had a quarter heart on every character, scoured the map for apples and found nothing. I was left with 2 options. Redo the entire level again and try to get up to the same point with more health at least on 1 character, or keep trying until I was good enough to kill him without being hit once. Yes, this game forced me to complete a boss without being hit once on my first playthrough of this game. This boss, as with most, was not only painfully boring, but became a moment of pure frustration. With this boss and its whirlwind patterns, it was difficult to improve, especially because any hit would kill me. I didn't even get the opportunity to see what could damage me, what part was damaging me. I would die instantly, have to reload my checkpoint and try again. Of course, there is an item in this game that allows you to heal 1/4 heart every 10 seconds. This would have helped me with boss fights, given that I was willing to stand, wait and heal, but of course, this game doesn't make it very easy for you to know that that's an actual thing you can unlock. So of course, by this point, I had no idea that was an option. I would want to conclude that this game should not be played on the first playthrough in the highest difficulty. It's not balanced well enough for it to be considered fun or challenging, but just tedious. I would happily restart the level again every time I died if I felt that my death was deserved and I could improve to avoid it. The main issue is that lower difficulties turn this game into a mindless hack and slash, making the game even more tedious, given the lack of strategy. In Breath of the Wild, there are an insane number of Korok seeds that you could collect. It was one of the things that prevented many people from 100%ing the game, and it famously had one of the worst rewards. The Korok seeds are back in Age of Calamity, but boy are they out of place in this game. This game has a number of reward items you can earn to upgrade your characters, either by buying them from a shop or simply by completing missions. It is not the most fleshed out way of getting items and can be annoying trying to find the ones you need in shops which constantly randomize their stock, or by having to use the sensor to find what levels can reward you said item. One of the items in this game cannot be bought and is rarely a simple reward item: the Korok seeds. In Breath of the Wild, the gameplay revolves around exploring and collecting items to become more powerful. By exploring, you can find Korok puzzles, and by completing those, you earn Korok seeds. You are rewarded by having your inventory increased, something which is incredibly useful when inventory space is so scarce. Both gameplay-wise and reward-wise, Korok seeds are appropriate, though the balance of how many there are and how many you should need for an upgrade is certainly up for debate. In Age of Calamity, this is carried over yet again for the sake of fan service for Breath of the Wild, and does not work for two major reasons. First of all, the exploration of the maps for such a large number of Korok seeds prevents the flow of gameplay. They are not something you will always find during the movement between areas as they should be. Instead, they are out of your way, causing you to have to stop combat and spend time looking for them. For many levels, you will spend more time trying to look for Korok seeds than anything else. You will either have to spend a long amount of time in between missions looking for them, which sadly works as the gameplay does not have a sense of time pressure in a lot of cases, or return to levels and spend time looking for them before the mission you know is the final one. They are not fun to find running around a 2D plane, and are collected by doing nothing more than a button press. The golden sculptures in Hyrule Warriors had a place in that game due to the time limit you were given to find it, and the fact that the original game's strategy meant that being away for too long could cause you to lose. They were never super difficult to find, but took enough time away from the player that they had to make a choice whether to risk losing keeps, or potentially their base, by taking time away to find the sculpture, making it fit within that gameplay. Secondly, the reward for obtaining Korok seeds is again to increase your inventory space. Items do not break, and there is little benefit to having lots of different items in your inventory. Whenever my inventory was full, it simply reminded me that I should be using these items at the blacksmith to upgrade one or two weapons into something better. Collecting Korok seeds breaks the gameplay and immersion of being in a tense battle, takes up more time than anything else, and despite this, provides you with a reward that is mostly useless. Unless you are going for 100%, there is no reason to go out of your way to collect Korok seeds. Let me state this outright. The UI and world map / menu for this game is not designed well. It's not only harsh to look at, being a mess of icons that essentially mean nothing, but completely unnecessary and takes away from what should have been given more detail. After the first chapter, I thought the gimmick was okay. The Breath of the Wild map as a way of obtaining upgrades seemed like a neat idea. By the third chapter, it already starts to look full, and by this stage it is already unviable to use the map over the menus. The world map in this game acts as your hub for everything available in this game, from upgrades to weapon forgery, challenges, quests and main missions, and each individual upgrade has its own icon on the map. After unlocking all the characters, the map is littered with literally hundreds of icons. The quests aren't quests like in most games. It's an upgrade system where you simply need to own the items listed and it will give you a reward in exchange for these items and a storyline of sorts for this upgrade. The whole purpose of this is to make it more like the world of Breath of the Wild, and while it may be confusing to the player to call various upgrade systems quests, which are dotted all around the map, its main issue is that they try and go for aesthetics over fluency in a menu. And what's worse is that these aesthetics become messy and horrific further into the game. Want to upgrade Impa's health? Well, find a quest for Impa? Oh, that quest gives her a different move. Oh, okay, this quest gives her an extra heart. Oh, I don't have these strange items. Can I buy some of them at a shop that randomly changes stock? Let's go through all of these shops, because you can't find them on the map. Though I appreciate the design of having a map that builds up over time, it's clear that it is not there for any reason other than fan service to make it look like the Breath of the Wild map. You will ditch this thing so early on in the game. This game does give you the option to look at the character's individual list of quests or upgrades rather than having to look around the map, which I appreciate, but whether or not you enjoy this map design, you are given the option to ignore it entirely, and that's most you could ask for. If I were to give my personal views with this map menu, which I shudder as I do, I would describe it as unaesthetic and irritating. I wonder how many people miss the only way, other than apples, leveling up, and Mipha's ultimate, to heal, simply because this game has a poorly designed UI. What would normally be side quests are actually called challenges, and they act in two different ways. Firstly, they act like any normal side mission, providing you with rewards for completion. I also found that this system acts as a replacement for Hyrule Warriors Adventure Mode, in which you can level up characters. I enjoy this decision of having the side missions within the main campaigns map, unlike the Adventure Mode map in Hyrule Warriors, because it encourages the player to do these side missions and level up the characters as they play along the main missions. At the start of the game, these side missions are a good way of keeping all of your characters to a high level. However, by the end of the game, you'll have so many characters and so few side missions for those characters that you'll either have to use the dojo system and spend all your rupees to level up your characters, or replay loads of missions over and over and over again. There is not enough content in the game to level up even half of your characters to a high enough degree to play the game without using one of these options. When it comes to Nintendo published games, you often will not have a large amount of bugs, and they deserve credit for this. They do, however, sometimes get away with very low performance on their games. Age of Calamity certainly makes the Switch seem like it has a much lower performance than it actually does. The game's dynamic resolution causes the game to significantly lower its resolution, while extreme frame dips still happen, which either means the resolution scaling does not work, or the game has such extreme frame dips that resolution scaling does not help much at all, dropping as low as 8 frames per second during combat in a game that is only combat is just unacceptable. Hyrule Warriors on the Wii U ran better, and worse yet, Hyrule Warriors on the 3DS was given criticism for dropping from 30 to 20 FPS. This game drops to 8, and has less enemies and worse AI. I don't understand how this game gets away with such bad performance. Now, when it comes to my critiques, I want to try and be as objective as possible, stating facts, backing things up with evidence, and therefore making points that can be proven either right or wrong. Obviously, when it comes to music, many aspects are subjective, especially what melodies you enjoy, or whether or not you don't like hearing a certain instrument. However, there are certain aspects that we can determine a metric for in terms of whether or not a piece of music works as part of a soundtrack. For example, the Temple of Time music in Breath of the Wild works as you're exploring the temple, and the music that comes on when being confronted by a guardian makes you feel tense. These are based on things like repetition, volume, and intensity of instruments, tempo, and especially key. The Guardian theme from Breath of the Wild is in minor key, has a loud repeating riff with a higher tempo and a large beat in the background. If you switched this track with the Temple of Time track, then they would be out of place. Debating two similar style tracks is not as easy, such as the two Guardian tracks in the Zelda series, and I mean these Guardians from Skyward Sword. Both of these tracks can be switched and would work because of the qualities they share, but which one you prefer will most likely boil down to subjective factors. As a side point, you will probably notice that the Skyward Sword Guardian theme is a lot more intense, with a lot more clashing of instruments and a lot more disturbing sounds. This is because the Guardians in Skyward Sword cannot be fought back against, but the Guardians in Breath of the Wild can. While the music in Breath of the Wild encourages you to run away initially, it is not so horrific that you aren't willing to fight back against them. In Chapter 1 of Age of Calamity, I noted my worry for the direction of the music. While the original scores such as the main theme, title theme, map theme, and some original level scores were incredible, the first two levels just used looped combat tracks for the majority of the time, which made you feel tense or want to run away for the majority of the level. This was done for no reason other than to use tracks found in Breath of the Wild, again making this game falter for trying such. In my original critique, I went into detail of how this repetition fell into the irritation category rather than the addiction category. Luckily, the full game has much better music design on most of the later levels. Let's take an example of the music used in the Gerudo Desert. This is a track from Breath of the Wild, and while it's meant to feel intense, it is designed in Breath of the Wild to be a theme of attack on Varna Boris. It still uses intense instrumentation, but incorporates 3 different melodic sections, all of varying intensity, while inciting positivity, using key. Therefore, this repetition will create an addictive feeling, while also being intense. This is the kind of track that also works in levels of a warrior game, and the fan favourite tracks in the original Hyrule Warriors game also followed this pattern, using different melodic parts, sometimes taking parts from different tracks, while also using intense instrumentation, with varying levels of such intensity throughout. I encourage you to listen to the tracks given in the description, as I can almost guarantee you will be able to pick up on this pattern. It is a battle within a war, and it should be intense, but these levels are designed to go on for a while, meaning the track should have a focus on being addictive and enjoyable. Furthermore, when Molduga shows up in the Gerudo level, the track changes to indicate the change in danger. However, if you want to run away from Molduga, his theme stops. This is what should have been the sound design for the Guardian in the second level, especially as that level encouraged you not to engage with the Guardian. The Guardian theme should have stopped when it no longer engages you. I reiterate, this is how sound design should be in this type of game, and using a track from Breath of the Wild is extra and should not be the priority. Though the opening of the game had me very worried for the game's soundtrack, the further you get into the game, the more enjoyable tracks you will find. A lot of remixes of Champions themes are done very well, and the main theme for this game is both sad and epic when it's required. When the game allows itself to do its own thing with the soundtrack, it does very well, incredibly well. I would be willing to say that some pieces from this game are amongst my favourite within the series. When the music is good, it's incredible, and luckily that's most of the time. But it's only when it forces itself to use Breath of the Wild's melodies and soundtracks that it can sometimes fall short. Age of Calamity takes place 100 years before Breath of the Wild, but has one major plot change. A guardian called Terrako has travelled into the past to warn Link and Zelda about the corruption of the Guardians and the return of Calamity Ganon. So now that the game has been out for a long while, I can make this statement without getting genuine hate messages from people worshipping Nintendo as their day job. Despite confusion in the marketing, this is not the prequel story to Breath of the Wild. I thought this was obvious from the demo that explicitly tells you the timeline is different and that the time-travelling Guardian would bring characters in from the future. I thought this was something that a vast amount of people would realise. I didn't think it was some hidden plot twist or something no players expected. Despite this, when I initially suggested this online, a lot of people were mad at me for even suggesting this wasn't the canon origin story. To all those people, thank you for making me laugh when this scene happened. We could discuss whether or not this was hidden from players, but instead I want to discuss this game's story on its own. This is an alternate timeline with some plot changes, as well as a relatively irritating and blaring plot problem. And no, it has nothing to do with the time travel or powers or any of that. It's about one simple fact, and I will summarise it by showing you the problem with this game's quarter-baked storyline. First of all, I am adamant that this game was rushed out with various plot changes happening throughout, causing the game to make little sense. So many plot threads do not add up, and one line that came late in the game made me want to laugh maniacally. At the start of the game, the time-travelling Guardian brings malice into the past. Because of this, the heroes find out that Guardians can be corrupted and turned against them. This is not something that was known originally in Breath of the Wild's timeline until the resurrection of Ganon, where all the Guardians turned on them at once. In Age of Calamity's timeline, well, this is no longer a surprise. Furthermore, they are shown images of Hyrule's destruction due to the corruption of the ancient technology. Unlike in Breath of the Wild, the characters know well in advance that this technology and the Guardians can be corrupted. So, what do they do with this information? Nothing. They change nothing. The heroes have the exact same plan of using the Guardians and Divine Beasts to defeat Calamity Ganon. Already I wanted to shoot myself at this writing. Then it gets even worse later on in the game. When the Guardians do eventually turn against them, Inpa actually spits the line, "I can't believe the Guardians turned against them." Either the writers of this game are stupid, or they want you to believe every character in this game is stupid. Link's origin story has been changed in Age of Calamity, and either ignores or retcons bits of lore we were given in Breath of the Wild and a lot of what was found in the Creating a Champion book. Of course, this isn't too big a problem, but I can see why a lot of people are going to be irritated by them changing lore. Oh, and by the way, did you think that they made Master Koga too much of a joke in Breath of the Wild? Or were you at least somewhat disappointed that the Yiga were not as menacing as they could have been? Well, prepare to have him turned into an even bigger joke. Though I predicted the 100 years in the future champions would be brought to the past, I also thought that the reason old fat Koga was in the past was due to the evil time travel guardian bringing him back. I was wrong. Instead, we get the revelation that Koga has always been pathetic, and remains the exact same build and lump of sadness for 100 years. No longer can Koga's weakness in Breath of the Wild be excused by the past 100 years going by, because apparently he has always been like this. Well, isn't that the story information that everyone wanted? I honestly do not believe this was always the intention. Suga should have been the original Koga, and Fat Koga should have been him from the future. There is no reason for that not to be the reality of the game, but for some reason we have this. By showing the evil guardian bring in enemies from the future, this would also set up Terrako bring in characters from the future as well. I could go on and on with how many things do not work narratively in this game. I could also go on about how much worse this game also makes the history of Breath of the Wild, making every character stupid and ruining established lore. If you loved learning about every bit of lore of Breath of the Wild's past, well, this game has the potential to piss you off. I only emphasise this because the gameplay is certainly not the selling point of this game, and the mismarketing and obvious last minute changes to the story means that this game's story surely can't be either. In the origins of Breath of the Wild, we know the champions were killed on their divine beasts by the Blight Ganons. This game has to solve how this was avoided to have an ending that is not dreary. As much as people may have wanted a prequel that ends with devastation, this was not the choice of the designers, which is fine. I would argue that things should have ended differently just from everyone being warned about the Guardians being corrupted in the first place, but whatever. The writers decided that the thing that would stop the champions from being killed is by having the future champions being brought in from the future. I'm not going to avoid this obvious point. This was only done to bring more Breath of the Wild characters into this game, and not because it's the best storyline. This definitely wasn't the best decision narratively. This brings up a whole bunch of questions on how this ability works. I'm sure many fans would have just preferred a canon prequel that ends morbidly rather than these time-travelling characters, but it is what it is. I have two significant points here. Firstly, the relationships between the champions and descendants is significantly underplayed. We have characters here who see their future descendants, and the descendants see the people that they have looked up to their whole lives. Now and then interactions happen between them in small dialogue boxes, but nothing that ever seems satisfying. Even Mipha and Sidon. Sidon was always a great character, but there is a sense of melancholy due to the loss of his sister. He experiences her through memory and isn't able to truly avenge her death until 100 years later. This game has the opportunity for a great moment where Sidon can travel to the past and save his sister. albeit a different timeline that won't really affect his reality, but even so it would mean a lot for the character. Not only does this interaction seem to be somewhat underwhelming, but it's majorly ruined by my second significant point. Despite the champions from the future coming in, they don't actually end up saving the champions. They simply delay them being killed for a few minutes until the character you are playing as arrives. The most damaging thing this does is hurt the little bit of actual meaningful narrative this game could have offered. The opportunity to play as Sidon and kill Waterblight Ganon before it kills his sister is ruined by it being a simple time halt in their loss. At least for me, it was until Link arrives and kills it himself. Perhaps in other playthroughs it may be fucking Hestu who saves Mipha instead of Sidon. This happens with each and every Blight Ganon fight, and ruins every possible moment here. It also completely undermines the power of the champions, showing that essentially double them isn't enough. The only part of this that I enjoyed was the fact they redesigned the Blights to be more individual in their design, but even that was ruined by the fact that you have to fight each one twice more on the battlefield, and 2 of them you have to annoyingly fight in the gimmicky Divine Beast fights. And yes, they are gimmicky. In terms of trying to evaluate whether or not this game is a good prequel is unfair because it's not a prequel. It is even less of a prequel game than I expected it to be. It is Hyrule Warriors, but it only provides fan service from one Zelda game. If Breath of the Wild is a game you adore, then you will enjoy some references and copied gameplay mechanics here and there, and a tiny bit more screen time for each of the champions. Though I swear some champions have almost just as much screen time as Breath of the Wild's memories. Remember when Nintendo advertised this as a prequel? Well, it wasn't, and part of me still believes they used the demo as damage control to show people it's a Warriors game with a separate story, but no one wanted to hear it. Remember when we were told that we would find out about relationships such as that between Urbosa and Zelda's mother, or even that we would learn anything new about any of these characters? Well, that was a blatant lie. This is a pointless alternate retelling of Breath of the Wild's memories with less emotional impact, and the relationship shown between Link and Zelda here is so inferior and one-dimensional that it's a joke. However, the character that I find that has been damaged the most by this game is without a doubt Revali. Going back to Revali in Breath of the Wild, it's easy to remember him as simply a dick, but there was more to it. I think the best way to explain the behaviour of this character would be from the voice actor himself.
So I didn't understand Revali at all until the DLC, and then I understood everything. And I wish I had known what we learned from the DLC back when I was recording for the main game. And it is that Revali, honestly, is the most reasonable champion in terms of his response to Link. His reaction towards Link is justified. The other champions I see are just immediately, they're very supportive of Zelda. They're like, hey, you know, I just want to protect you. I just want to protect the land of Hyrule. I want to protect my people against, you know, Calamity Ganon. So if you say this guy is going to be our savior, cool, I'm behind it, because the alternative is dying and I don't want to take that risk. Revali is the guy who sequestered himself onto a snowy mountaintop so he could practice a skill and didn't bother telling anyone, and I mean deliberately tried to hide from everyone until he had mastered the skill before he started showing it off. This is not someone who was like, I made another advancement to my skill. Come see what it does now. Come see what it does now. He didn't want anyone to see anything until he was certain that he would get it right. So for him to go through all of this work to master his ability to earn the respect of his people, and then have this kid in a blue tunic, I almost said green, I'm so sorry, Zelda fans, I've lost my cred card twice, to have this guy show up with nothing to prove how powerful he's supposed to be, and have the princess of the kingdom go, yeah, he's good. He's your superior now. That's frustrating. That's really frustrating for 2 reasons. 1, all the work you've done was only good enough to make you someone's subordinate. And 2, if that superior doesn't actually, like, pull their weight, y'all are dead. You're done. Like, that's it. That's the end of the kingdom.
Revali's behaviour towards Link is somewhat justified. This probably made him the most interesting character in Breath of the Wild. In Age of Calamity, he's just a dick, and that's to everyone. It's uncomfortable to watch interactions with this character as he's so horrifically dumbed down. If you want to play a Warriors game and like Zelda, play Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition. It'll be more worth your time. But if all you play is Breath of the Wild and you really need to get this game for more content, I wonder if this game is somewhat insulting to you. In terms of lore, it doesn't care about it. It will change the lore that should have happened, and I'm talking about things that wouldn't be affected by the point of time travel. What I find to be the most damaging part of this is not just the changes to the lore, but what it does to the characters. All characters are now completely one-dimensional, such as Zelda and Rivali. Breath of the Wild had little story, and most fans wanted this game to fill in gaps, explore characters more, explore relationships more. When I decide to critique something, it may be because I love that thing. Sometimes when I know a game or movie is heart poured into it, the creators wanted it to be the best it could possibly be, it deserves credit, and thus any criticism I give it is more constructive. However, sometimes things are bad because they are easy money grabs. Corners are cut, studios get involved. When the passion and effort is not seen, these things become more irritating. This is when objective criticisms can often bring out an emotional response. Sometimes a movie is bad, but you know the creator had passion. I don't get angry criticizing it, I'm just aware of its flaws. Other times a movie is bad and it could have been good, especially by the creator's standards, but fails due to an obvious lack of effort or arrogance. The Nintendo community is a tough one to tackle. I consider myself a massive fan of Nintendo and a ridiculous fan of the Zelda series. You don't have to be a level-headed Nintendo fan for long to realise how much of the fanbase is delusional and unwilling to critique anything Nintendo does. For example, when Nintendo makes an obvious cash grab or makes an error in writing during a game, Nintendo fans will get mad at you for pointing out said error, whether it's obvious or not. They believe that Nintendo is perfect in every aspect, that the Zelda timeline was ever planned and not written by someone who had nothing to do with writing the game's stories. I am someone who believes critiquing fairly allows you to give praise where it is absolutely deserved. A good story can't exist if bad ones don't exist. Therefore, as big as a Nintendo and Zelda fan I may be, I'm not willing to herald anything they whip out in front of me. Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity feels like a low-effort fan service game to Breath of the Wild, and is not the Hyrule Warriors prequel game it should have and could have been. The one-on-one combat becomes repetitive very early on, and this is a major problem considering the game provides no real gameplay outside of this one-on-one combat aside from finding Koroks. The combat in Age of Calamity had the potential to use new combat systems to be an improvement on Hyrule Warriors' combat system, but aside from that, the original Hyrule Warriors is superior in pretty much every way. There are less enemy types, less playable characters, less good playable characters, less mission types, a complete lack of strategy, a nonsensical story, and oh my god does this game become so much more repetitive so quickly. There are no new basic enemy types after the second chapter of the game. Completing this game's main campaign is 20 to 30 hours killing moblins over and over and over and over, and if you want to complete this game in its harder difficulty, then you will have to do a lot, if not most of the side missions. These are bite-sized versions of the same enemy fights and will rarely feel any different. So if you want to go through completing this game on the highest difficulty from the start, it takes around 35 to 40 hours of killing moblins, some wizrobes, some guardians, who become even easier than moblins, boss type enemies who will be reused again and again, and more moblins. If you don't play this game on the higher difficulty options, then it becomes a mindless hack and slash. There isn't really a way to win here. This game does deserve credit in a lot of places. I'll start controversially by saying it better title screen than Breath of the Wild. An in-engine cutscene with soft music showing a view atop the central Hyrule Tower. This title screen would have been excellent in Breath of the Wild. The soundtrack has gorgeous tracks within it. The game's main theme has genuinely become one of my favourite melodies in the series, and it's the way it's used in every track which makes it even more brilliant. The remixes of Breath of the Wild songs are sometimes neat, but it's the original tracks this game offers that is where it shines. Some of the stages are brilliant expansions on areas in Breath of the Wild, turning ruins into actual villages. One set piece in this game that I will give significant credit for is the atmosphere of the final stage and the final boss. While the problems with healing certainly tampered with my experience with these bosses, making them an annoying difficult rather than a fun difficult, it was definitely an epic finale for the game. I also personally found the design for this version of Calamity Ganon to be incredible. Not only that, but the final boss was very well done as a fight. Though he has some slow moves that can be easily read, most of his moves are fast and not always predictable. If you want to flurry rush him, you have to learn his moves. Stasis doesn't last long, so you can't abuse it on him. The voice acting in this game seemed like a significant improvement. The counter system is certainly a good step forward over previous Hyrule Warriors games. However, it was just the complete lack of strategy and enemy type that makes the gameplay more repetitive, much more than the previous Hyrule Warriors game. The story is nothing to really fall in love with. What was initially a brilliant idea, an idealised way of expanding the Breath of the Wild universe and exploring its time period, had been rushed and could have easily been fixed in a short period of time. The storyline, which makes no sense and no effort to be in line with Breath of the Wild's already established lore, as well as a complete lack of complex gameplay which would have made fighting the same enemies over and over more bearable, causes me to have no reservations in saying, this game presents a product of lower quality than what should be expected. At least it's not as poor as the Link's Awakening remake copying the Breath of the Wild logo. Look at it. The absolute fucking laziness of Nintendo recently. Breath of the Wild is a ruined Hyrule, that's why the logo was edited to look aged. Why the fuck is Link's Awakening using this? I apologise, I've wanted to complain about this for almost 2 years. While the initial premise was to bring together the Warriors games and Breath of the Wild together, this game isn't able to truly satisfy either of them, and that's a shame. This game could have been something incredible.